The airport was full of noise, movement, and excitement. People rolled their luggage across the floor, stood in long lines, and kept checking their phones. Some were rushing for business meetings, others were going on family vacations, and a few just looked tired from long flights. In the middle of all this, a quiet man stood near the gate for first class, wearing simple clothes, just jeans, a black t-shirt, and a worn-out backpack. His face was calm, his eyes soft, and he didn't try to draw attention to himself. Most people walked right past him without looking twice, but a few turned their heads, squinted, and whispered to each other. "Is that Keanu Reeves?" Someone asked. "Can't be, he looks too normal." Another replied with a shrug. Even though he was a world-famous actor, Keanu had a way of blending in, almost like he didn't want to be noticed at all, as the airline staff called first. "Class to board." The quiet man picked up his backpack and walked toward the gate. He smiled politely at the flight attendant, who gave a little nod of recognition. He didn't expect any special treatment. He just followed the rules like everyone else. Once on board, he found his seat by the window, sat down, and took out a small paperback book. He began to read quietly, while the rest of the first class passengers entered. A few rows behind him, a businessman in a sharp gray suit was also boarding. He wore a gold watch that sparkled under the cabin lights, and he held a phone to his ear, talking loudly. "Yeah, I'm flying first class as usual," he said with a smug tone. "You know how it is, can't stand coach bunch of peasants." He ended the call with a grin and looked around proudly, as if waiting for someone to admire him, as he moved toward his seat. He noticed the quiet man sitting by the window, still reading his book. The businessman raised an eyebrow and gave a short, mocking laugh. "Look at that," he muttered. "They're letting just anyone in first class these days." The man beside him chuckled, not knowing who the reader was. "Maybe he won a contest," the other replied, and both men laughed under their breath. The businessman sat down right beside Keanu, still smirking. He leaned over and said, loud enough for others to hear, "You look familiar, buddy. Do I know you from somewhere? You fix my car or something?" Keanu looked up and gave a gentle smile. "No, I don't think so," he said softly. Then he returned to his book without another word. The businessman wasn't finished, though. He turned to the man across the aisle and said, "You know who this guy looks like? That actor from those fake martial arts movies, what's his name? Keanu something." "Keanu Reeves?" the other man asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, that's it. What a joke," the businessman scoffed. "Guy gets paid millions to swing a stick and look confused." He laughed at his own joke, expecting others to join in, but most passengers stayed quiet. Keanu heard everything, but he didn't react. He just kept reading, calm as ever. He could have responded, could have defended himself, but he didn't. That wasn't his style. He had dealt with people like this before, and he knew that silence often spoke louder than words. The businessman leaned back in his seat, still grinning. He whispered to himself, "Bet he's flying on someone else's ticket." Even though he said it quietly, the words carried in the quiet cabin. People shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to say something or just ignore it. Meanwhile, a flight attendant walked by and gave Keanu a small nod. He nodded back with a soft smile. She didn't say anything, didn't make a scene, but her respectful glance said it all. She knew who he was, and she also knew he didn't want attention. She moved on, letting him stay in his peaceful world. The plane continued boarding, and the businessman kept tapping on his phone, making business calls, talking loudly, and cracking jokes. He clearly wanted everyone to know how important he was, but the man next to him, the one he mocked, just kept reading his book, completely at peace. To the businessman, he was just a quiet, poorly dressed guy in first class who didn't belong there. But soon, something would happen that would make everyone, including him, see the truth. The plane was still on the ground, and passengers were settling into their seats. Some were putting away their bags. Others were flipping through magazines or adjusting their pillows. The air inside the first-class cabin was cool and quiet, but the businessman sitting next to Keanu Reeves was already restless. He looked over at Keanu again, shaking his head slightly. He still didn't know who the man really was. Or maybe he did, but just didn't care. He leaned over and spoke, again this time a little louder. "Hey man, if you're gonna sit in first class, at least dress like you belong," he said with a smirk. Keanu turned his head slightly, offered a polite smile, and replied, "Comfort is important when flying." Then he turned back to his book, clearly not interested in a long conversation, but the businessman wasn't done. He seemed to enjoy the sound of his own voice. He waved his hand in the air, trying to get the attention of a nearby passenger. "Can you believe this guy?" he said, chuckling. "Looks like he walked in off the street." The man he was talking to gave an awkward smile, unsure of how to respond. "I mean, seriously," the businessman continued. "Jeans, old shoes, a beat-up backpack. This is first class, not a bus stop." He laughed again, proud of his own joke. Some passengers looked over, curious about what was going on. A few recognized Keanu but stayed quiet, watching how things would unfold. Keanu said nothing, just flipped to the next page of his book. His face was calm, peaceful, like he had practiced patience many times before. The businessman noticed the silence, and it seemed to bother him. He expected a reaction, maybe even a small argument, but he got nothing. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice this time. "Let me guess. You're one of those method actors, right?" he said with a mocking grin. "Trying to stay in character, pretending to be poor so you can feel more real in the next sad movie you make?" Keanu looked up briefly and said, "I'm just traveling, like everyone else." There was no anger in his voice, just calm and honesty. The businessman raised his eyebrows as if surprised. He laughed again, more to himself this time. "You people are all the same," he muttered. "You play pretend for a living and then think you're heroes." He leaned back, crossed his arms, and sighed loudly. To him, Keanu was just another celebrity who didn't deserve the respect or space he was getting. Other passengers began to feel the tension in the air. Some looked away, pretending not to hear, while others stared at the businessman with disapproval. A woman sitting nearby whispered to her husband, "That man doesn't realize who he's talking to." Her husband nodded. "He'll regret it soon enough." Still, Keanu didn't respond. He didn't argue, didn't ask the flight attendant for help, and didn't look angry. He just sat quietly, reading his book, as if none of the rude words could touch him. It was clear that he had experienced situations like this before and had learned how to rise above them. The businessman pulled out his phone again and began speaking loudly, making sure others could hear. "Yeah, I'm in first class, next to some quiet guy pretending to be deep or whatever," he said to whoever was on the line. "I swear these Hollywood guys think they're philosophers or something." He laughed again, but his voice was louder than necessary. The flight attendant passed by and gave him a polite but firm look. "Sir, we kindly ask all passengers to keep their voices down while we finish boarding," she said. The businessman rolled his eyes but nodded. Keanu looked up and gave the attendant a soft smile, and she smiled back before continuing down the aisle. The businessman looked at Keanu again and shook his head. "Must be nice," he said, "getting paid millions to act like you care." Keanu finally closed his book gently and placed it on his lap. He turned to the man and said softly, "I try to care for real." The words were simple, but something in his voice made the businessman pause. There was no pride, no anger, just truth. But still, the businessman shrugged. "Whatever, man," he said. "I'll be watching from the real world while you swing fake swords and save fake cities." He chuckled again, but this time it sounded a little less confident. Maybe it was the way Keanu looked at him, not with hate, but with understanding. The plane doors finally closed, and the engines began to hum. Passengers settled into their seats as the safety instructions began. The businessman pulled out his headphones and leaned back, still smug. But a few passengers nearby glanced at Keanu with quiet admiration. They knew something the businessman didn't. And soon, he was about to find out too. The plane was in the air now, gliding smoothly above the clouds. The seatbelt signs were off, and passengers began to relax. Some opened their laptops, some closed their eyes to rest, while others flipped through in-flight magazines. The first-class cabin was quiet, peaceful, except for the man in the suit who still glanced at Keanu Reeves now and then. He didn't speak anymore, but the way he looked said everything. He still didn't respect him. Keanu sat in his seat calmly, looking out of the small round window beside him. The sunlight lit up part of his face, and for a moment, he closed his eyes. His face looked peaceful, like someone who had learned how to carry calmness inside. In his hands was the same old book, worn at the edges, with a bookmark poking out. He wasn't watching a movie or scrolling through a phone, just quietly reading and thinking. He didn't look rich, didn't act famous, and didn't seem to care what anyone thought. That alone made some people curious. Who was this man, really? The flight attendants knew, of course. They had seen many celebrities over the years, but Keanu was different. He never asked for special meals or demanded attention. He didn't wear sunglasses indoors or flash a shiny name tag. Instead, he greeted each staff member with a soft smile and a quiet, "Thank you." He helped an elderly man put his bag in the overhead bin without being asked. And when a woman spilled her drink near her seat, Keanu was the first to hand her a napkin. The businessman beside him noticed all this but said nothing. He still believed Keanu was just putting on a show, trying to look good in public. He crossed his arms and shook his head slightly, thinking to himself, all fake. But Keanu wasn't performing for anyone. He didn't even know people were watching him closely. To him, being kind wasn't something to show off. It was just something you did. It was how he lived his life with simple kindness and quiet respect. Later, a young flight attendant walked down the aisle, checking on each passenger. She paused near Keanu and smiled warmly. "Mr. Reeves, would you like anything? Water, tea, anything at all?" Keanu looked up, smiled back, and said, "Just some water, please, thank you." His voice was gentle, almost shy. He didn't speak like someone used to being treated like a star. He thanked her again when she brought the water and even added, "You're doing a great job." The businessman turned to look out the opposite window, pretending not to hear. But something in his face had changed, just a little. He didn't laugh, didn't roll his eyes. He just stayed quiet as the flight continued. A little girl walked up the aisle from economy holding her mother's hand. She pointed toward Keanu and whispered, "Mom, it's him." The mother gave her a quick smile, then leaned down and whispered something back. The girl nodded, but she couldn't stop looking, Keanu noticed, and gave her a small wave and a smile. Her face lit up, and she waved back shyly before walking back to her seat. The businessman watched, this too, and again, didn't say anything. Maybe he was beginning to wonder if he had misjudged the man beside him. A few minutes later, the flight crew announced that dinner would be served. As trays were passed around, Keanu helped the attendant, again, offering to pass meals to people in his row. He even gave his dessert to an elderly woman who said she had a sweet tooth. All of it was done quietly without any show or announcement. The businessman finally spoke again, this time in a quieter voice. "You always this helpful?" he asked without looking directly at Keanu. Keanu glanced over and gave a small shrug. "I just tried to do my part." There was no pride in his words, just honesty. The businessman nodded slowly, as if thinking about something. He didn't joke this time, didn't mock. He just went quiet again. Keanu returned to his book, sipping his water now and then. The soft hum of the plane filled the silence. Outside the window, the sky was painted in shades of orange and gold as the sun began to set. Inside, something else was shifting. An energy, a mood, maybe even a feeling of respect beginning to grow. Some people in first class still didn't know who he was, but they felt something about him. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, yet people felt better around him. They felt calm, safe, like he brought peace with him wherever he went, and the man in the expensive suit who had mocked him earlier was beginning to feel something too. It wasn't respect yet, not fully, but it was the start. A small crack in his armor, a moment of quiet thought, and though he would never admit it out loud, he was starting to realize that maybe this quiet, humble man wasn't the one out of place in first class. Maybe it was him. The flight had been calm for the first few hours. Passengers were comfortable in their seats watching movies, listening to music, or reading books. The cabin lights were dimmed, and soft music played quietly in the background. Everything seemed peaceful, like any normal flight. But suddenly, something changed. From the back of the plane in the economy section there was a sound. Someone shouting. It wasn't loud at first, but it quickly got the attention of nearby passengers. People began to turn their heads, confused and worried. The voice came again, this time louder. It was a woman's voice, full of panic. "Help, please, someone help!" The flight attendants rushed to the back, moving quickly but calmly. A few moments later, more people stood up to see what was happening. There was a child, no more than 5 years old, slumped in his seat, not moving. His mother was crying, shaking his shoulders, trying to wake him up. Her face showed pure fear. The boy's skin looked pale and his body was limp. People began whispering, some gasped, others looked frozen, unsure of what to do. One of the flight attendants grabbed the intercom and made an announcement. "If there is any doctor, nurse, or medical professional on board, please press your call button immediately." Everyone in the plane waited, hoping someone would stand up, but no one did. No doctors, no nurses, no one with training. Seconds felt like minutes, and the mother kept crying. Holding her child close, the cabin grew tense, filled with silent fear. Then from the front of the plane, Keanu stood up. He didn't run, didn't panic, just walked quickly and calmly toward the back. Some passengers looked surprised. Others just moved out of the way. He reached the row where the mother sat, dropped to one knee and gently asked, "May I help?" The mother looked at him with tearful eyes and nodded, not caring who he was. Keanu leaned in, checked the boy's breathing, and placed 2 fingers on his neck to find a pulse. He turned to the flight attendant and asked for the emergency medical kit. She ran to get it while Keanu spoke to the mother in a soft, steady voice. "Did he eat anything strange? Has this happened before?" The mother shook her head. "No, never. He was fine just a few minutes ago." Keanu opened the medical kit and pulled out the oxygen mask. He carefully placed it over the boy's face, making sure it fit properly. Then he checked the boy's pulse again and kept monitoring his breathing. He didn't shout or show fear. He stayed calm, focused, and kind. Passengers nearby were amazed. The same man who had been sitting quietly, reading a book, was now helping save a child's life. Even those who didn't recognize him could feel the seriousness in his actions. He clearly knew what he was doing. The businessman in first class stood up halfway and looked down the aisle. He couldn't see much, but he could hear the whispers. "Is that Keanu Reeves?" one person asked. Another replied, "He's helping the child, he's actually helping." The businessman sat back down slowly, his face no longer smug, but thoughtful. Meanwhile, Keanu continued working. He tilted the boy's head gently, checking, again for signs of improvement. After a few minutes, the child stirred a little, his eyelids fluttering. The mother gasped and held his hand, crying softly now. Keanu looked at her and said, "He's going to be okay. He just needed some oxygen." The flight attendant, now kneeling beside him, asked, "Where did you learn to do all this?" Keanu smiled gently. "I've taken emergency medical training," he replied, "just in case." He stayed by the child's side for a while, making sure everything was stable. When the boy opened his eyes fully, Keanu smiled at him and said, "You're strong, little guy." The child blinked and gave a weak smile in return. Everyone watching let out a breath they didn't know they were holding. Keanu helped the mother adjust the child's blanket, then stood up and nodded to the crew. "If anything changes, let me know," he said simply. Then he walked back to his seat quietly, like nothing big had happened. No show, no spotlight, no attention-seeking. But now, the entire cabin knew who he was, not just by name but by heart. They had seen something rare. A man who used his fame not for pride but to serve others. Back in first class, the businessman looked straight ahead, eyes wide, lips tight. He didn't say a word, but his silence said everything. People looked at Keanu differently now, not as an actor but as a human being who stepped up when it truly mattered. And though the flight still had hours left, the journey had already changed something in the air. Kindness had made its presence, known louder than any words ever could. The cabin was quiet again, but it felt different now. There was a soft respect in the air, like something sacred had happened. The people who had seen Keanu help the child were still thinking about it. Some were whispering about it quietly, others just sat in silence. Everyone had watched the same thing. A man they thought was just a movie star had turned into a real life. Hero, Keanu was back in his seat now, sitting just like before. He had picked up his book again, but his eyes weren't reading. He looked out of the window, watching the clouds go by as the plane moved smoothly through the sky. His face was calm, but his mind was still with the child. He had done everything he could, and the boy was safe. For now, the flight attendant came by once more, speaking in a low voice. "The mother says thank you, she's very grateful." Keanu nodded kindly. "I'm just glad he's okay." He didn't want attention, didn't want praise. He had helped because it was the right thing to do, not because someone was watching, but people had been watching. Especially the man in the gray suit, the businessman who had mocked Keanu, earlier who had laughed at his clothes, his silence, and even his career. Now that same man was sitting stiffly in his seat, arms crossed, but his eyes full of thought. He looked over at Keanu again and again, this time not with judgment but with quiet confusion, maybe even regret. How could I have been so wrong? He thought to himself. This man whom he had made fun of for being just an actor had done something real, something brave. The businessman had money, power, status, but in that moment of crisis he had been frozen, and the man he laughed at had been the only one to move, to act, to save a life. Minutes turned into an hour, and the sun began to set. The sky outside was painted in orange and gold, soft light pouring through the windows. Keanu closed his eyes, for a moment resting his head back gently. He didn't speak, didn't even shift in his seat. He looked peaceful, like someone who had nothing to prove. The flight attendants walked quietly up and down the aisle, checking on passengers. They passed Keanu and smiled, their eyes full of respect. One of them leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "I've never seen anything like that." Her coworker nodded. He didn't even hesitate. Farther back in the plane, the child was now resting peacefully in his mother's arms. His color had returned and his breathing was steady. The mother looked forward, toward first class, with eyes full of gratitude. She had no idea who Keanu Reeves really was as a celebrity. To her, he was just the man who had saved her little boy. Back in first class, the businessman finally cleared his throat and spoke. He didn't look at Keanu directly, but his voice was softer than before. "You were fast," he said. "Back there with the kid." Keanu opened his eyes and turned to face him. "I've had some training," he replied simply. The businessman nodded. "Most people wouldn't know what to do." Keanu gave a small smile. "I think most people would try if they could." There was a pause, heavy but not uncomfortable. The businessman looked down at his expensive watch, then at his perfectly polished shoes. He felt something strange, something he wasn't used to. Shame, maybe even humility. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the most important person in the room. "I was pretty rude earlier," he said suddenly, the words awkward in his mouth. Keanu looked at him and nodded gently. "I noticed." The businessman gave a weak laugh, surprised by the honesty. "But," Keanu added, "you're talking differently now." The businessman nodded. "Yeah, I guess I am." Another silence followed, but it felt more honest than before. No sarcasm, no arrogance, just two men sitting side by side, one learning something he didn't expect, the other offering kindness. Without a lecture, as the plane moved through the fading light, the passengers slowly drifted into quiet rest. The man who once mocked Keanu Reeves had now seen something real, something true, and while he didn't fully understand it yet, he knew one thing for sure. He would never look at that quiet man the same way again, because real strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly with a book, helps without being asked, and steps forward when others freeze. Sometimes a hero doesn't wear a cape. Sometimes he wears jeans, carries an old backpack, and smiles softly when no one's watching. The plane was flying smoothly now, floating above the clouds like a quiet bird in the sky. Most passengers had calmed down after the earlier emergency. Some had gone back to their movies, others were trying to sleep. But no one had truly forgotten what had just happened. Especially not the businessman sitting. Beside Keanu Reeves, he had spent the last hour thinking, replaying everything in his head. The words he had said, the jokes he had made, the way he laughed at Keanu's clothes and quiet nature. He remembered calling him a fake, saying actors were useless. And then, he saw that same man calmly save a child. No panic, no showing off, just clear action and quiet strength. The businessman stared out the window now, his reflection looking back at him in the glass. He didn't feel proud like he usually did. His expensive suit, his shiny watch, his business class ticket. They all felt small now. He realized that when something truly serious happened, none of those things had helped. It was the man in the plain black t-shirt and old shoes who had stood up. Back in the economy cabin, the little boy was resting. His mother kept looking toward the front, her eyes full of thanks. She didn't care if the man who helped her son was famous or not. To her, he was a blessing, a stranger who appeared when she needed him the most. A flight attendant passed by and softly asked Keanu if he needed anything. He simply said, "No, thank you," with a smile. She looked at him for a moment, wanting to say more, but she didn't. She just nodded and walked on, her heart still touched by what she had seen. The businessman finally broke the silence between them again. "You know," he said quietly, "I thought I had people all figured out." Keanu looked up, waiting. "I judged you the second I saw you," the businessman admitted, "and I was completely wrong." Keanu didn't speak right away. He just looked at the man, not angry, not smug, just listening. "That's okay," Keanu said gently. "Most people do." The businessman sighed, leaning back in his seat. "I thought you were just another actor," he said, "all show, no depth." He paused, then added, "But you knew exactly what to do, and I didn't." Keanu gave a small nod. "It's not about acting," he said. "It's about learning, caring, and being ready." There was something in his voice that made the businessman feel small and inspired at the same time. He had built his life on money, power, and image. But here was a man who lived by quiet action and kindness. A man who had trained to save lives, not for applause, but for moments, just like this. The businessman looked down at his hands. "They don't teach you that in boardrooms," he said with a weak laugh. Keanu smiled. "Life teaches it if you're open to it." That simple answer felt like a wave of truth, washing over years of ego and pride. A few minutes later, the captain made an announcement. They were beginning to descend slowly toward their destination. People began waking up, fastening their seatbelts, and preparing for landing. But the atmosphere in the cabin was still different. Quiet, thoughtful, respectful. One more time, the mother from the back walked slowly toward the front, holding her son's hand. She stopped beside Keanu's seat and whispered, "Thank you again, sir." Keanu looked at the boy, smiled, and said, "You're a brave little man." The boy smiled shyly and waved. Then they walked back to their seats, leaving behind a moment that would never be forgotten. The businessman saw it all and felt his chest tighten. He wasn't the same person who had boarded the plane. Something had shifted inside him. He had seen true humility, real strength, and quiet courage, and it had come from the person he least expected. As the wheels of the plane touched down on the runway, a soft thud filled the cabin. People clapped quietly, a mix of relief and gratitude in the air. But for the businessman, this wasn't just the end of a flight. It felt like the beginning of a change, a new way of seeing people. He looked at Keanu one more time and said, "You've given me a lot to think about." Keanu just smiled again and said, "That's all any of us can hope to do." And with that, they sat in silence as the plane rolled to a stop. One man still quiet and calm as ever. The other, once loud and full of pride, now speechless in the best possible way. The plane had landed safely, and the soft buzz of movement returned. To the cabin, passengers stood up slowly, stretching their legs and opening overhead bins. The crew began preparing for departure, smiling politely as people gathered their things. But even in the small sounds of zippers and rustling jackets, something felt different. This wasn't just the end of another flight. For many on board, it was the end of something small inside themselves, and the beginning of something much bigger. Keanu Reeves remained seated, calm and unhurried. He waited patiently as others stood up, not pushing forward like some eager travelers. His book was back in his bag and his seatbelt was still fastened. He didn't seem to be in a rush, maybe he never was. The businessman beside him stood up, but paused. He looked down at Keanu, and his usual confidence was no longer on his face. There was no smirk, no sarcasm, just quiet respect. He took a deep breath and then said something he wasn't used to saying. "I owe you an apology." Keanu looked up and simply nodded, as if he had already forgiven him long ago. "You didn't." "No," Keanu replied gently. "I judged you the second I saw you," the businessman admitted. "I saw your clothes, your silence, and I thought you were nothing special." Keanu smiled slightly. "That's okay. A lot of people feel the need to judge before they understand." The businessman ran a hand through his hair, feeling a little awkward. "I thought being successful meant being loud, always being seen," he said quietly. "But you showed me the opposite." Keanu's eyes were kind. "Sometimes, the ones who say the least are the ones who do the most," he said, the businessman stepped aside as Keanu slowly got to his feet. He picked up his backpack, old, simple, and full of more stories than anyone could guess. As they stepped into the aisle together, passengers turned to watch, not because he was a celebrity, but because of what he had done. They smiled, nodded, even whispered thanks. No one asked for a photo. No one treated him like a movie star. They treated him like a good man. And maybe that meant more. Near the front, the same mother who had cried earlier was now waiting. Her little boy stood beside her, holding her hand tightly. As Keanu walked past, the boy reached out with his free hand. Keanu stopped, bent down slightly, and gave the boy a gentle fist bump. The child smiled shyly, and his mother whispered, "We'll never forget you." Keanu replied softly, "Take care of each other." Then he stepped forward again, his walk as quiet and steady as always. The businessman followed him closely, still thinking about everything that had happened. As they reached the jet bridge, the bright light from outside filled the narrow space. Keanu paused for just a second, looked out at the world waiting beyond. Then he walked into it without needing attention. No cameras, no crowds, just a man stepping forward into another day. The businessman stood there for a moment, watching him walk away. He didn't call out, didn't try to stop him. There was nothing more to say. Everything that needed to be said had already happened in the sky. Back inside the plane, passengers gathered their bags and made their way out slowly. Some were smiling, others quiet, but all of them were carrying something with them, something they hadn't boarded with, a memory, a lesson, a reminder that kindness doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it wears old shoes, reads paperback books, and saves lives without asking for praise. The businessman walked through the airport with his hands in his pockets. He passed by designer stores, expensive coffee shops, and giant billboards. With famous faces, none of it seemed important anymore, not after what he had seen. He took out his phone, opened his notes, and began to type something. Not a business idea, not a deal, just a few words he didn't want to forget. Be the quiet one, the kind one, the one who helps. He saved it and closed his phone. For, once he didn't need to impress anyone, he walked toward the exit slowly. Somewhere in the crowd, Keanu Reeves had already disappeared, blended back into the world like he always did. But the impression he left behind was not going anywhere, because real power isn't in being seen. It's in being remembered for the right reasons. And on that flight, the man in the plain black t-shirt had done something no movie could ever show. He had reminded everyone that greatness is not about fame, it's about heart. The sun was shining outside the airport as people walked out, dragging suitcases and calling taxis. Some were meeting family, some were rushing to meetings, and others were just tired from the long flight. But for the passengers of that one plane, something had changed. They had all come from different places and different lives, but for a few hours they shared a moment they would never forget. Keanu Reeves had already stepped into the crowd, disappearing like a shadow in sunlight. No security team, no loud announcements, no flashes from cameras. He simply walked away, quiet and peaceful, like the way he lived. And yet, his presence still remained. not in a physical way, but in people's minds and hearts. The mother who held her child close kept whispering to him as they walked out of the airport. "That man was an angel," she said. "He saved your life." The little boy didn't fully understand, but he nodded and smiled. He had felt safe when that man held his hand. He would remember that feeling for a long time. Far behind them, the businessman came out of the terminal slowly. His suit was still perfect, his shoes still polished, but something inside him had shifted. He walked with less pride now, and more thought. His eyes scanned the crowd, maybe hoping to see Keanu again, but he knew the man was already gone. He stood still for a moment, surrounded by noise, but feeling something quiet inside. Then, without even thinking, he took off his expensive jacket and folded it over his arm. He no longer felt the need to look important, he just wanted to feel honest. That night, stories began to spread. One passenger posted a short message online saying, "Keanu Reeves just saved a child on our flight." Another shared a photo, not of Keanu, but of the boy smiling after he woke up. The story spread quietly but powerfully, not through gossip or news shows, but through whispers of respect. People didn't praise him for being a celebrity. They praised him for being human, for stepping up when no one else could, for being kind when no one was looking. Keanu never posted about it, never gave an interview. He didn't need to. That moment was never about him. It was about doing what was right. That's who he was. And people slowly began to realize that maybe the real heroes don't wear costumes or fly through the sky. Maybe they sit next to you on a plane, wearing old sneakers and carrying a worn-out book. Somewhere in the city, the businessman sat in a quiet cafe, his phone in front of him, untouched. His coffee was cold, but he didn't notice. He was thinking about the look in Keanu's eyes, the calm in his voice, the way he said, "Most people do." When speaking about being judged, the businessman opened his email app, started writing a message to someone he had argued with earlier that week. He apologized simply and honestly. Then he closed his laptop and sat back. He felt lighter, not because he had done something big, but because he was starting to do something true. He took out a small notepad from his bag, something he rarely used. He wrote down just one sentence. "Be the kind of person who would help a stranger without being asked." He read it twice, folded the paper, and placed it in his wallet, not for the world to see, but for himself. Keanu Reeves didn't know about any of this. He had already moved on to the next quiet place, maybe reading another book or helping someone else in silence. He didn't need applause. He didn't need to be told he was good, because goodness was already a part of him, like the air he breathed, and, for everyone on that flight, that short moment in the sky had become a lesson about kindness, patience, humility, and quiet power. It reminded them that you never know who is sitting next to you. You never know what they've done, what they carry, or what they're capable of. So be slow to judge and quick to listen, because sometimes the person you laugh at today might be the one who saves someone's life tomorrow, and sometimes the ones who say the least teach us the most.